Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Atheist Delusions by Bentley Hart, critiquing it from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover chapters 8 and 9 of the book. So let's get started right away with chapter 8, Intolerance and War. Hart begins by arguing that the wars of religion, which took place throughout Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, should be thought of as conflicts fought for the purpose of establishing secular supremacy over the church, not as wars of religion, as they are collectively referred to as. He says, quote, "They were certainly not, at any rate, some sort of continuation of the tradition of the Crusades, the only holy wars in Christian history. The Crusades, after all, began as a perfectly explicable, albeit in the event brutal and frequently incompetent, response to tales of atrocities committed against Eastern Christians and Western Christian pilgrims." Hart goes on to lament the imperialism, slavery, political terrorism, and world wars that followed what he calls the era of a united Christendom, then completes the thought this way, quote, "Far from the secular nation-state rescuing Western humanity from the chaos and butchery of sectarian strife, those wars were the birth pangs of the modern state and its limitless license to murder. And religious allegiances, anxieties, and hatreds were used by regional princes merely as pretexts for conflicts whose causes, effects, and alliances had very little to do with faith or confessional loyalties." So let's take a closer look at the picture Hart is painting here. He says the European wars of religion shouldn't be seen as religious wars at all, and are definitely not comparable with the Crusades, because the Crusades were wars pitting Christians against Muslims, while the wars of religion were Christians against Christians, where the particular religious allegiances of the warring parties weren't really that important. If Hart's intention is to establish that the wars of religion were about more than just religion, I can totally get behind that, as I think do most historians that I have read on the topic. And granted, I am, as with most historical matters that we're going to touch on in this series, I'm far from an expert, I'm far from a scholar, I'm far from anything more than a somewhat interested amateur in this subject. But it seems to me that most people who study this subject acknowledge that the wars of religion were not 100% about religious differences between the warring parties. And surely, if Hart recognizes that those conflicts were about more than religion, he must be capable of recognizing that the same thing was true about the Crusades. Were the Crusades holy wars? Well, certainly they were. But they were also driven by much more earthly concerns. Islamic forces were conducting campaigns of conquest, taking control of territory that they considered to be rightfully theirs, and Christians considered to be rightfully theirs. It was a religious conflict, yes, but it was also a political one and a territorial one. On both sides, it was about more than just defeating people who had pledged their allegiance to the wrong god. It was about land and power and influence and security. And the same was true of the wars of religion in the 16th and 17th century. Were they all about religion? Of course not. Of course, there were rival nation states or rival factions within nation states fighting each other, struggling for supremacy. But how can Hart so minimize the fact that the inciting incident of the earliest of the wars of religion was the Protestant Reformation? The Reformation itself was about more than disagreements over religious doctrines. It connected to class conflicts, the increasingly urgent demands of the common people to be more empowered and less beholden to the wealthy and to those in authority, be that authority ecclesiastical or state authority. But I don't think Hart would argue that the Reformation was not a religious event, or at least cannot be understood as a religious event alongside whatever else it may have been. Why then does he expect us to accept that the wars of religion that followed the Reformation were not religious events, or that it is unfair to understand them and describe them in terms as being religious events? That just doesn't make sense to me. That to me testifies once again to this man's incredibly obvious bias in favor of his particular version of Christianity. Well, anyway, the answer to that question, the answer of why he expects us to believe that the wars of religion were not actually religious, seems to be that Hart views the last several centuries of Western history primarily in terms of a conflict between Christianity and secularism, secular modernism. In his mind, secularism won that conflict, and the world has been so much the worse ever since. But not only is he bitter over the victory of secularism, he blames secularism for starting the conflict in the first place. In Hart's telling, it was the forces of secularism seeking to subdue the church once and for all, the sometimes wayward but essentially virtuous and benevolent church, that caused his coveted united Christendom to fracture and turn against itself. He says, quote, "There is moreover something extravagantly, even obscenely absurd in the fiction that the new secular order of state supremacy rescued Europe from conflicts prompted by religious faith and thereby at long last brought peace to the continent." He then presents a list of the various European conflicts that followed in this era of supposed peace, right on up to the Second World War. His point is that the modern era is unsurpassed for its scale of violence and the number of casualties caused by its wars. He's right, unfortunately. Our wars have become bigger, bloodier, and deadlier as history has run its course. Very often, secular states haven't gotten along with one another any better than opposing religious empires did once upon a time. And the most devastating modern wars have not been fought between religious factions, but between secular states. True, the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East can be viewed in terms of the secular or the Christian West fighting the Islamic world. But as with the other wars already discussed, that's not the only perspective from which they can be viewed and understood, although they can certainly be viewed and understood as a religious conflict. But Hart seems to be implying that the large-scale death and devastation of modern warfare should be blamed on secularism. For instance, he says, quote, "The 30 Years' War, with its appalling toll of civilian casualties, was a scandal to the consciences of the nations of Europe. But midway through the 20th century, Western society had become so inured to the idea of war as a total conflict between one entire people and another that even liberal democracies did not scruple to bomb open cities from the air, or to use incendiary or nuclear devices to incinerate tens of thousands of citizens, sometimes for only the vaguest of military objectives. Perhaps this is the price of progress or liberation." Those of you who have been watching this series from the beginning, remember in an earlier episode when he took a historian to task for presuming to know what the inner motives of Christians were for offering charity and helping the sick? Isn't it interesting that Hart himself claims the ability to know what was in the consciences of people living in Europe centuries ago when he says that the appalling toll of civilian casualties from the 30 Years' War was a scandal to their consciences? How would he know? Anyway, the quotes that you see in that passage I just read around the words progress and liberation should indicate Hart's disdain for those concepts in this context, because he's referring to secular progress and liberation from church authorities. Once again, I think he's right to call out modern democracies, including the United States, perhaps especially the United States, that are able to so easily justify the bombing of other countries and rationalize the often appalling loss of life that results as regrettable but unavoidable collateral damage. We do take that too lightly. We do turn away from that too eagerly. We, and especially those of us who are responsible for shaping and carrying out the policies of which those bombings and other military actions are the result, do sleep too soundly at night. But here's my problem with what Hart is saying, and here's why, for all the points on which I agree with him, I find his to be an incredibly arrogant position. Is he really so sure things would be different if the church were running the show instead of secular states? The level of devastation we see in modern warfare is largely due to developments in the technology of war and the growth of the world's human population. Simply put, there are a lot more of us than there were 500 years ago, and it's a lot easier for us to kill each other on massive scales. Can you blame this on modernity? I suppose you can, because much of it is the result of modern technology and the modern accumulation of the human population, which just naturally grows larger and larger as time goes by. So I suppose in a sense you can blame it on modernity, but can you blame it on secularism, as Hart seems to be doing? I don't really see how that's fair, unless you can explain why it's reasonable to expect that a more religious, less secular world, or a society governed by a less secular, more religiously influenced government would necessarily be a more peaceful one. And if necessary, I can provide evidence why I don't think it's reasonable to expect that a more religious world would necessarily be a more peaceful one. I mentioned it in passing a moment ago. Take the example of the Middle East. Much like Christendom in Europe of centuries past, religious authorities, in this case Islamic rather than Christian, wield a great deal of social and political power. There are distinctions made between religious and secular authorities, but just as in Europe 500 years ago, those distinctions aren't really that meaningful. The state sanctions certain religions but not others. The laws are heavily influenced by the state's preferred version of Islam, which has resulted in things like adultery and homosexuality and atheism being made illegal, in some cases punishable by imprisonment or even death, which a nation under a truly secular government that guaranteed citizens equal treatment under the law regardless of religious affiliation could never allow. And most relevant to the topic at hand, the fact that the region consists mostly of countries governed by religiously influenced authoritarian governments has not made it more peaceful. Instead, it's one of the least peaceful regions on the planet. Now, I don't think secular democracies have bragging rights here. As Hart points out, we haven't given up war, we've just gained the ability to export it to other parts of the world where we don't have to deal with it directly. But the suggestion that we would be more peaceful if we were more religious, or if the church had retained its pre-Enlightenment political powers, is absurd in the face of what we see in very heavily religiously influenced parts of the world today, particularly those parts of the world that are heavily influenced by very conservative, authoritarian, orthodox forms of religion. Now, I know Hart isn't arguing for more religious influence, but for more Christian influence, and particularly for more influence of his type of Christianity. But as he himself admits, Europe under the banner of Christendom was not exactly a peaceful, egalitarian paradise, and I can't think of any form of oppression now seen in the Islamic world at its worst that we wouldn't expect to see in a world ruled by the Christian equivalent of those Islamic fundamentalists. Would Hart claim that conservative, orthodox Christianity, unchecked by a secular rule of law, is better for LGBTQ folk, or women, or apostates than Orthodox Islam? Can he possibly believe that? Would he argue that Orthodox Christianity is innately more peaceful than Orthodox Islam? Again, I'm not arguing that a less religious society is automatically more peaceful, tolerant, inclusive, etc. than a religious one. But for the life of me, I don't see how Hart can seriously believe the opposite to be true, that a more religious society is necessarily more peaceful and more tolerant and more inclusive. I will argue that a secular government is preferable to a religious one, by the way. I'll die on that hill if necessary. A secular government that neither outlaws nor officially recognizes any religion is the only form of government I know of under which religious liberty can be protected and religious pluralism can be allowed to thrive. If Hart wants to argue that an explicitly Christian government is better than a secular one, I will fight him on that point all the way. But anyway, before we move on to the next chapter, Hart does make plain what his argument is and why he thinks things were better in the pre-modern Christendom era in Europe, when the church claimed for itself the power to decide when and how to go to war. Hart says, quote, The reason such conventions could actually serve even partially to limit aggression is that they proceeded from a spiritual authority that no baptized person, however powerful or rapacious, could entirely ignore. A moral authority greater than the ambitions or sovereignty of any lord, monarch, or state. With the advent of modernity, however, and the collapse of Christian unity in the West, the last traces of that authority were effectively swept away. Well, I suppose that would be better than what we have now, provided you have faith in the institution that claimed the right to act on behalf of that spiritual authority. David Bentley Hart apparently has a great deal of faith in that institution. Me, not so much. Let's move on to chapter 9 of the book, which is titled An Age of Darkness. Hart starts this chapter this way, quote, "One could go on indefinitely, really, adducing one example after another of false or distorted history and then attempting to correct the record. But in the great struggle for the past, these engagements amount to mere local skirmishes, at the end of which we have accomplished little more than to confirm what we already knew, that men are rarely as good as we might hope, though not always as bad as we might fear, and that powerful institutions are as often as not gardens of ambitions and injustice." Well, I've read the entire book up to this point, so I can corroborate that he has accomplished little other than to confirm what he already knows. That and to inflate his page count by taking several pages to belabor every point he tries to make. I take him at his word that he says, when he says that he could go on like this indefinitely. No objection here, no argument here, David. I believe you. Hart restates his main arguments, the ones that he's belabored and buried under minutiae and a multitude of redundant examples up to this point, that the influence of Christianity was responsible for fostering the development of modern science and many of the other bits of social and political progress we cherish today. But that doesn't mean Hart thinks Christianity is completely benign. Quote, "Christianity has been the single most creative, cultural, ethical, aesthetic, social, political, or spiritual force in the history of the West, to be sure. But it has also been a profoundly destructive force, and one should perhaps praise it as much for the latter attribute as for the former, for there are many things worthy of destruction." What has Christianity destroyed, I wonder, that Hart considers worthy of destruction? Let's see. Well, mostly he's talking about the pagan religion of the Romans, it seems. The old gods, Hart says, had been used for too long to justify the cruelty of the Roman Empire with its crucifixions and its bloody gladiatorial entertainments. Well, thank goodness no powerful Christian institutions have ever used their god to legitimize their own unspeakable crimes, eh? Boy, then we'd be in a fix, wouldn't we? Is there a large group of people who blame Christianity because they wish crucifixions and gladiator matches were still around? Hart's main argument seems to be that modern people blame Christianity for being a destructive rather than a creative force. But are they basing their arguments on the Christian destruction of the most violent and excessive elements of pagan Rome? Also, I can't help but notice that despite the violence and brutality of Rome, which Hart credits Christianity with doing away with, he is cheering for Christianity succeeding at doing the exact same sort of thing that Rome used to do and tried and ultimately failed to do with Christianity itself, which is to obliterate opposing religions and opposing customs and establish its own dominance and supremacy. When Rome used its power to crush other religions and to persecute and oppress Christians, that was bad and cruel. But when Christianity rose to power and did the same thing, well, that was a good thing, because some things are worthy of destruction, mostly things that aren't David Bentley Hart's religion. Hart moves from the positive destruction wrought by Christianity to his argument that faith and reason are not in opposition to each other. Why? Because reason requires faith. Faith in basic premises, which by necessity lie at the bottom of all lines of reasoning. There are certain essential propositions we must affirm on the basis of faith, not reason, Hart says, before any reasoning can be done. Now, come on. I know it seems like this is what I'm doing, but I'm not saying this next bit for effect. I was genuinely disappointed when I read this bit in the book. Hart's view of history and the role played in it by his church may be distorted by his bias, and his bitterly low regard for modernity may make much of this book read like a more articulate version of a rant from a resentful old man complaining about kids these days. But I honestly did not expect him to try and equivocate on the definition of the word faith in order to make a point about Christianity and its compatibility with reason. Most of the time, in fact, every time I have ever heard anyone make the argument that religion and faith are at odds with each other, when someone says that faith and reason are incompatible, they're talking about religious faith. They are explicitly referring to faith in the religious sense, faith in the existence of a God, the authority of a priest, the occurrence of miracles, things for which there is no hard empirical evidence, things which must be believed, if they are to be believed at all, on the basis of the trust of the believer in the truth of what they have been taught in church or read in their scriptures. That is the sense in which they mean the word faith. Belief without evidence. Belief despite lack of evidence. They aren't talking about the sort of faith that one must have in first principles in order to reason. The assumption that certain propositions must be true in order for anything to make sense. That is not the same sort of thing as religious faith. And it's either sloppy or incredibly dishonest to treat those two very different senses of faith as if they're the same thing. They are not. Hart does eventually make the point that holding a religious belief or believing oneself to have had a religious experience does not automatically make one less rational or one's culture more primitive than one that doesn't believe in such things. And on this we agree. It is entirely possible for a rational, intelligent person to hold a belief that I or someone else would find utterly absurd, including the belief that a given God exists, or that a miracle took place, or that a given text is divinely inspired. I might consider those beliefs to be absurd, to be insufficiently substantiated by evidence, but that doesn't mean the person who holds them is necessarily less rational than I am. So hey, another point of agreement. In fact, we've had a few of those piling up in this video so far, so perhaps I got a little ahead of myself a moment ago with the whole faith equivocation thing. Maybe I was a little too hard on old David Bentley Hart. Maybe we're about to turn a corner and find some more common ground. Quote, "There is, after all, nothing inherently reasonable in the conviction that all of reality is simply an accidental confluence of physical causes without any transcendent source or end. Materialism is not a fact of experience or a deduction of logic. It is a metaphysical prejudice, nothing more, and one that is arguably more irrational than almost any other." Well, that didn't last long, did it? I'll try to cover this well-trodden ground as quickly as possible. Materialism, the philosophy of materialism, the belief that the universe is material in nature, physical in nature, and that's it, doesn't require you to believe that there is anything accidental about reality. Most people who believe that the universe is a natural physical place and that's it also believe it to be an orderly and predictable place, at least on the level at which we typically experience it, not a random, chaotic place. If the universe were a random, chaotic, accidental place, we could not do science. We could not make predictions. We could not test results. The universe has to be orderly, at least to an extent, for us to be able to figure out what's going on. And materialism is quite reasonable once you recognize that it is a provisional conclusion based on available evidence. So far as we have ever been able to determine, The physical, natural universe is all there is. Now, does that mean that we can conclude to a 100% physical certainty to the exclusion of any and all hypothetical, yet to be discovered evidence that this is true? No. Can we imagine ways in which this proposition might be proven false, forcing us to revise our conclusion? Yes. But for now, given what we know about the universe, about what it is, about what it's made of, about how it works, how is it unreasonable to conclude that reality is a physical, natural phenomenon and is not a supernatural or spiritual one, or it does not have a supernatural or spiritual component? When we've been doing science in the modern sense for a few hundred years now, and every single thing we have ever explored and ever explained turns out to have a natural, materialist explanation, how is it unreasonable to conclude that that's what the universe is and that's how it works? I would add that one can acknowledge that this is a rational conclusion and still disagree with it. If Hart wants to say, well, I can see how you got there, but I just don't think that's the right answer, that would be fine. But that's not what he's saying. He's saying it's irrational, and not just irrational, but perhaps more irrational than other views of what the universe is and how it works. Aside from deferring to his own considerable bias and arrogance, I don't see how Hart can conclude that materialism is not only irrational, but more irrational than any other point of view. Crucial to Hart's refusal to consider materialism as even a rational possibility is his insistence that existence itself is a mystery that no scientist can ever hope to solve, since there is no way to explain how any part of reality could have been the cause of its own existence. This, Hart says, points toward an eternal and transcendent first cause, and at least he does explicitly acknowledge his debt to Aquinas when he makes that argument. In other words, there is something rather than nothing, and we don't know why, therefore God. Hart devotes the remainder of this chapter to a prolonged diatribe against the modern concept of freedom. And this subject was touched upon briefly in an earlier chapter. Hart's point is that the modern notion of freedom is based on the supremacy of the individual will, something that cannot be limited and does not need to be justified, but is seen as, in Hart's words, its own highest standard, its own unquestionable truth. Hart says, quote, "It is, at the very least, no longer possible to believe, in naive Enlightenment fashion, that moral truth is something upon which all reasonable persons can agree, or that it is something that, in being grasped, exercises an irresistible appeal upon the will. Nor is it possible any longer to deceive ourselves that humanity, free from religious authority, must inevitably advance toward higher expressions of life rather than retreat into pettiness or cruelty or barbarism." Once again, I think Hart is jousting at windmills here. Most people I know of who argue that we are better off now, morally, socially, politically, scientifically, than we were prior to the Enlightenment, wouldn't say that freeing ourselves from religious authority would lead us to inevitably advance. It's true that there are many excellent reasons to prefer not to be bound by religious authority, including the belief that the gods from which that religious authority supposedly originates don't actually exist. But that doesn't mean being free from that authority automatically causes you or your society to begin advancing toward a higher moral existence. And I would add, the opposite argument is true as well. Just because you embrace a religious authority, just because you recognize some concept of divine objective morality that you believe proceeds from the authority of God himself, that does not automatically mean that you are going to progress into a higher, more knowledgeable, more humane, more peaceful society, as Hart seems to be suggesting that it does. Neither of those things are true. Nor am I familiar with many modern people, religious or otherwise, who argue that moral truth is something on which we can universally agree and which is irresistible once grasped. While there are some moral matters on which we can have something close to universal agreement, morality in general is a very messy business on which we're bound to disagree significantly as we struggle to decide how we ought to be thinking and acting toward each other in our environment. For all his high-minded rhetoric and ostentatious erudition, it's striking how defensive and reactionary so much of Hart's writing is. He's created this caricature of a modern person who is unthinkingly worshipful of an abstract concept of reason to which he has devoted little actual thought, who sneers at all things religious, but most especially Christianity, who views science as a source of incontrovertible knowledge, who is arrogant and hedonistic. It's simplistic, it's reductive, it's grossly self-serving on the part of Hart, and no less a straw man than the hypothetical atheists that Christian apologists have been imagining themselves debating for decades. Well, let's have one last quote before wrapping up this chapter. Quote, "It is my governing conviction in all that follows that much of modernity should be understood not as a grand revolt against the tyranny of faith, not as a movement of human liberation and progress, but as a counter-revolution, a reactionary rejection of a freedom which it no longer understands, but upon which it remains parasitic. A post-Christian unbeliever is still, most definitely, for good or for ill, post-Christian." Hart believes this because he privileges his religion and makes certain, to me, unjustified claims regarding the uniqueness and originality and necessity of some of his values and principles, some of his faith's values and principles, I should say. And since I afford Christianity, Hart's, or anyone else's no such privilege, I might rewrite Hart's final sentence in that quote to say something like this: "A post-Enlightenment Christian is still most definitely, for good or ill, a post-Enlightenment Christian." Christianity was just as changed by the Enlightenment as the rest of Western culture. I, for one, am grateful for that, though I wish those changes had been a bit more extensive and pervasive. But luckily, much to the chagrin of David Bentley Hart, I imagine, it's an ongoing process. Well, that's it for this video. That's it for these two chapters. I will be back in the next video in this series to take a look at the next two chapters, and we will also begin part 3 of the book. Part 3 is entitled Revolution, the Christian Invention of the Human. And we will be looking at chapter 10, The Great Rebellion, and chapter 11, A Glorious Sadness. So that's it for this video, everybody. Thank you as always for watching. Please feel free to comment on what I have had to say here today. If you agree, if you disagree, if you are an atheist or a Christian or some other stripe of believer or non-believer, I would be very interested in hearing your opinion on what I got right, what I got wrong, what I could have said better. Whatever you have to say in response to what I have had to say, I'm interested in hearing from you. Also, if you enjoyed this, if you found this of some use, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and please consider helping me. Boy, I just can't talk today. Have you noticed that I can't talk today? I apologize. Please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of this channel for as little as $1 a month. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.